In this episode, I share with you my first ever NDE. This is Before the Void. Welcome to the Plumb podcast. I'm Rosalee.
And I'm Sarah.
And we are the Plumb Collective.
This episode is part 2 of the void conversation, even though chronologically it comes before what you heard in part 1. For me, listening to part 1 and then listening to Before the Void, I needed to hear part 1 first. It was the perfect order for me to hear them.
Privately to myself, consider the first part of the void conversation as the magic moment. It really was this magic moment that I experienced. Warm and peaceful, and it feels good. That's the space that I was in when I was talking about all of it, even the parts that are hard to talk about. I think it's a welcoming, gentle starting point for this hard to hear conversation. It was the starting point for me to start talking about it because it's the most wonderful part of the story for me. But I knew it wasn't chronological. I knew it wasn't the linear way to tell the story. What I ended up talking about in this next recording is the perfect follow-up, even though logically I was expecting to go a totally different direction. I followed the feeling, and this is a really great representation of me following the feeling, that even though my logical brain was like, well, you should tell the story like this, and you left people on a cliffhanger or going this direction, and it's like, no, this really feels like the next part.
It felt that way for me too, to hear it. And in listening to part 1, I definitely felt a lot of things, and it was very powerful, and I was engaged, and it was amazing to listen to. And I had a really different experience with listening to this part, in that it elicited for me a lot of emotion. Not that the first part didn't elicit emotion, it absolutely did. But this was different and more intense. I just felt so much compassion for you and wishing things had been different, and in awe of you and your life. And I really enjoyed your storytelling, even though it's a hard to hear story. You share these really specific micro moments that put me right there with you, and just honestly made me want to be right there with you in this story. And I think that was the source of my emotion, is feeling right there with you and knowing that I wasn't, and wishing that I had been. So you did an amazing job telling this story, even though it was hard for you to tell. And I'm really proud of you.
Thank you so much. And I wish you had been there with me too. Being with you makes me feel so much less alone. I really felt alone during this part of the story. You will hear raw and real emotion throughout this episode. If it becomes too much, please stop. You will hear details of my medical history. You will also hear me talk about restriction. If those are things that are just too hard for you to hear, you can skip this episode.
You could preview what is said by looking at the transcript and skimming and seeing if it feels possible for you to listen.
Please take care of yourself, comfort yourself, and know that this was my life. I was there for every second, every moment of the wound care changes. I was there. I was present, and I was aware.
You often say that this story is hard to hear, and then you follow up by saying, and it was harder to live. And I was feeling that and experiencing it as I was listening, knowing my experience of listening, like, yeah, it is hard to hear. And then remembering, yeah, and this was harder for you to live. And I want to witness you and be here with you in the telling of this story. At least I can be here for that.
Thank you. I feel that. Today is January 5th, 2025. It is the 20th anniversary of having my colon removed. It was the first time I had a near-death experience, and it was the first time I needed a surgery to save my life. I was planning on telling a different part of this story, but when I realized the date lined up for the 20th anniversary, I still can't believe it. It's been 20 years since having this major surgery. This is a part of the story that I don't enjoy talking about, my medical history. It was really, really hard. A childhood of torture. There was a lot of wear and tear on my body. By the time I turned 18, my digestive health system was a mess. I was in pain constantly. I was bleeding, throwing up. I became used to the constant cramping and nauseous feeling. I've been sick for so long. I don't really even know what it feels like to feel well. From 18 to 20, I struggled. I tried a lot of different medications. It got to the point where surgery was necessary. I had gone in for a consultation. It was something that I had scheduled for February of 2005. I had gone out with friends on New Year's Eve and I had fun, but it was really challenging. I wasn't feeling well at all. I made it through the New Year's Eve party and New Year's Day. I was alone in my apartment. My roommates had gone back to their families for the holiday season. I was alone. From New Year's Day to January 5th, 2005, I was in and out of consciousness. I was in septic shock. I had gotten so used to feeling so unwell that I didn't realize that the pain had gotten to a level that I was not able to maintain consciousness. Finally, I realized that I wasn't sure what day it was. When I realized that, I knew I needed help. I called a friend that lived in the same area that I did, and I said, I need you to take me to the hospital. I don't know how I got downstairs. I don't know how I got in the car or to the hospital. The next thing I remember is needing to have a scan to see what was happening. And I was in an area of the hospital that seemed like the basement. It seemed like we were underground. I was in a wheelchair. I remember regaining consciousness in the wheelchair in the basement, being by myself in a hospital gown, not knowing how I got there. New Year's Day until January 5th, 2005, that was my experience. Being awake, looking around, not knowing how much time had passed, if it was morning or if it was night, if a week had gone by or if it had been an hour. I had no concept of time or where I was. I was alone. I know that I had surgery for many, many hours. The surgery took a lot longer than they expected. They told my parents they weren't sure if I would survive. My mom was not taking it seriously. My surgeon had to tell her, your child might die. They told my parents that my colon was the worst they had ever seen. It looked as if someone had taken a blowtorch to my insides. My formal diagnosis after being misdiagnosed a bunch of times is ulcerative colitis. My colon was just completely blackened, filled with ulcers. I barely survived that surgery. I had drains and a PICC line and all sorts of tubes. I just remember my mom acting so terribly. She was throwing tantrums and refusing to get help for me when I needed pain medication. She'd just tell me to wait, that the doctors know what they're doing, and when there was a nurse that was doing things that she shouldn't have done, which I ended up filing formal complaints against. My mom was just like, oh, let it go. Don't make a big deal of it. Just relax. She was not helpful at all. She was a hindrance to the entire process. When it came time for me to be released from the hospital, I actually really don't even want to talk about all of it. I'm not in the mood right now to talk about my mother and to talk about how she treated me during this. She made it so much worse. She took a situation that was so scary. Previous to having my colon removed, I had only had my tonsils and adenoids removed. I had never had such a major life-altering surgery. Instead of doing everything to take care of me and support me, she made everything worse. Unfortunately, I had to go to my parents' house to recover. And on night one, I set up my bed and got my pain medication and something to drink and my phone and everything that I needed. And I fell asleep. When I woke up, the pain medication was gone. My mother was cruel. She intentionally took it and hid it so that I would be in pain and that I would need to ask her for help. She could refuse me, she could belittle me, and she could enjoy my suffering. I feel sick to my stomach talking about this. The idea was that after having my colon removed during that procedure, they also took a lot of my small intestine to make a fake colon. They call it a J pouch. For 3 months, that was supposed to heal. The intention is to have a second surgery where they reconnect everything to the J pouch, and you go from having a temporary ileostomy to being reconnected. Knowing everything I know now, I would never have had that reconnection surgery, but I didn't know. I was very weak. I was fighting infection. I really should not have had that second surgery, but I was young. I wasn't 21. I had just recently gone through a breakup. The thought of having a permanent ileostomy for the rest of my life, I wanted to try everything I could to have a quote unquote normal experience of life and have my body seem more normal. I wish I would have thought about it differently, but that's how it was talked about to me, and that's really all the information that was available to me at that time. 3 months later, very weak, very much should not have been under anesthesia again. I was reconnected. It failed miserably, but we didn't know if it would fail or not. There were periods of time where I was kept in the hospital on bowel rest, which meant that I was not able to eat or drink. This happened many times. It would be 6-8 weeks at a time that I would be in the hospital on TPN. It was horrible. I already had experiences with my mother restricting my food, refusing to feed me, refusing to cook for me, refusing to allow me to have things, even though I lived in a restaurant. I did not have access to food. So to be in the hospital for such a long time and not be able to eat or drink, you don't realize how much people talk about food until you can't have any. I didn't realize how much food was shown on TV, in every commercial, every TV show, every movie. I couldn't escape it. People would come to visit and all they would talk about is what they had for lunch or where they were going for dinner. I think people were more awkward and more offensive because they were unsure of how to talk to me about what was going on with me. But all I really needed was to be asked what I wanted to talk about and if I was okay. It was a miserable time. Not being able to drink water, it affects you mentally, that type of restriction. And after a lifetime of restriction and control by my mother, it just seemed cruel, even though I knew it was to try to save the J pouch and have the surgery not be for nothing. It felt like cruel and unusual punishment for something I had never done. They have these little sponges that are on a stick. You dunk into water and then wet your mouth, your lips, and go along your gums to hydrate. Sometimes for a treat, I would allow myself to just bite down on the sponge and get a couple droplets of water. I couldn't do it too often. I knew any amount of liquid by mouth would impact the healing that we were hoping would happen, that I could save the J pouch. Eventually, I was allowed to start eating and drinking, but it was very minimal. Jello and Cool Whip. It was hardly anything at all. And I was fighting an infection for I don't even know how long. I was very weak. I had to be in a wheelchair. It was really, really hard. I'd finally gotten strong enough that I could go back to my apartment and get up the stairs. I was at my apartment alone. My roommates were gone and my dad called. I answered the phone. I was watching America's Next Top Model and I was paging through a magazine. He said, "Your mom is cold." And I was so confused. I just remembered Tyra Banks's voice in the background as I was flipping through a magazine. And he said, "No, I think she's dead." And I was like, what? I had just seen them days before. It was my former friend and roommate. It was her birthday. Both of my roommates went back to our hometown, ended up moving back there. I went back for my former friend and roommate's birthday, and I saw my parents. My mom was acting really erratic, which was usual for her, but there was something different about her behavior. On a regular day, she was really mean to me, but on this day, she just was screaming at the top of her lungs and slamming things around. And on a regular day, she would tell me how ungrateful I was, but this was to another level. She basically got herself worked up and refused to speak to me. She went and laid down for the rest of the time that I was visiting. I just spent time with my dad, and then I left and came back to my apartment. Before I left, I said to my dad, I'm like, something is really wrong with her. She is acting worse than usual. He said that he would keep an eye on her, and if she's still acting like this tomorrow, that he would take her to the doctor. He would make her go to the doctor. The next day is when he called me and said that she was cold. It was all happening so fast on the phone. When he said, I think she died, I said, well, what do you mean you think? You don't know? And he said, no. And I said, did you call 911? And he said, no, I called you. And I go, what am I going to do about it? I was several hours away. I'm like, you need to call 911. I was like, hang up. I assumed he was just like in shock, but it also fits the bill that I had been parentified since before I was born. If you followed the baby notebook, you know they were counting on me before I even came into the world. That continued throughout my life. Even though I was the child, I had been parentified. The fact that he was calling and asking me for advice. We hung up, he called 911, and I got in the car to drive back to where I had just come from the day before. I was weak and nauseous and in pain. Unbeknownst to me, I was experiencing the beginnings of septic shock. As I was driving back to my parents' house, I received a phone call from an unknown number and I answered it. It was a police officer, state trooper. I'm calling to inform you that Rosalee has died today. And I said, well, I'm Rosalee. And he said, no, Rosalee's dead. And I said, no, I'm Rosalee. No, Rosalee's dead. This person argued with me on the phone that Rosalee was dead. And I'm like, no, Rose. Her name was Rose. I'm Rosalee. That is how I found out that my mother had died. Was being told that I had died, which feels symbolic. When I got there, I didn't want to see her. But how their house was set up and the fact that their bedroom door was open, I ended up seeing her big toe on her right foot. It was the last I ever saw of my mother. When they were taking her out of the house, I sat outside on the curb and I called the adult man that used to live in the house. We had just broken up and I had just almost died, and now my mother died. His response was, I'm just glad it wasn't your dad. He's the only other person alive who knows what it was like in that house, who my mother really was. He did not mourn for her, and neither did I. In the moment, I was so sick. I was so physically unwell. I couldn't really understand what was happening. I wasn't sad. I didn't feel relief at that point. I guess kind of like stating facts, taking care of business. I had been estranged from my mother's family for my whole life, practically. Some of her siblings called to talk to me after they found out. I was screamed at. They were wanting a death certificate. They wanted documentation, pattern recognition, and abilities told me that they were trying to do what they ultimately ended up doing, which was cutting me out of my grandmother's will. I wasn't going to make it easier for them by hand delivering my mother's death certificate. One of the earliest videos I made on TikTok is me saying that my life has been hard and weird, and it has been hard and weird. Every time my life has been hard, people have made it harder. My mother's family made that situation much harder. I was staying at my parents' house dealing with everything that was going on with my mother, and I was getting progressively more ill. I had a fever every day. I was in excruciating pain. I ended up having an exam under anesthesia to see what was going on. They didn't find anything conclusive. I came back to my dad's house and I was sleeping in the front room. I heard a voice of knowing. It was the first time I felt sound. It's very much what I experienced during photo readings. It's what I would refer to as intuition, but at the time I had never heard it. It was only something that I felt deep in my gut. What I heard was, if you get up, you will live. If you stay down, you will die. It was very clear. I was miserable. I was so tired. I was so tired. But I thought about my dad, and he had just found his wife days before. If I stayed in the bed, I just knew that in the morning he would come to check on me and find me the same way. And I just couldn't do that to him. I continued to take care of him and put his feelings before mine, like I had done my whole life. If you ever think I'm cutting my dad too much slack, just because I'm not talking publicly about him in the same way that I talk about my mother, you'll appreciate this little quote from him, because it's what I think of often. After I was out of the woods and everything was okay, that time anyway, I told my dad what happened. I heard this voice and why I chose to do what I did, why I chose to get up. It was so rude, it was so cruel, and it wasn't funny at all. He looked at me and scoffed. I would have been fine. I would have been sad for a minute, but I would have gotten some donuts and I would have been fine. When I heard that voice, I was so weak. I couldn't stand. I couldn't speak. I fell out of the bed onto the floor. I thought that would maybe make enough noise to wake him up, but it didn't. I crawled on the floor until I made my way into the living room, and then I just started pulling things down off of a shelf so that it would make enough noise so that my dad would hear me. He came out of their bedroom and he saw me on the floor surrounded by stuff. He would have been in his 70s and using a cane. We were quite the pair. I don't know how he got me into the car. We somehow got loaded up and he drove me to the nearest hospital, which is not a very good hospital. The doctor yelled at me. At the time, this had never happened to me before. Unfortunately, since then, this has happened to me multiple times. But you go to the hospital for help, to have a doctor in a white coat look at me and say, "I don't know what's wrong with you." He threw his hands up in the air and he goes, just get out of here. Just get away from me. I don't know how to help you." He couldn't get my fever down. It just kept going up. He was frustrated with me. They had packed me in ice, literally in a hospital bed with the railings up. They put a sheet over the bed and then just dumped ice into the bed. I was laying in ice in the bed and my fever just kept climbing. At around 104 degrees, this doctor said for me to get away. He put me in an ambulance and turned the lights on and the sirens on and drove to the hospital that I had my original surgery in the city where I lived. The whole way in the ambulance, one of the EMTs kept holding my cheeks between her hands. And then she'd tap my cheeks. "You have to stay with me. I need you to keep fighting. Don't give up on me now. Stay here." When we got to the big hospital, it's a teaching hospital, they brought me in and right away were trying to get fluids into more veins. When I had the surgery to remove my colon in 2005, it was an emergency surgery. It was a near-death experience, but I was unconscious for most of it and I didn't feel like I went anywhere. I did feel as if I was floating outside of my body, watching things happen. It was for a split second when I was in the basement waiting for the scan. I saw myself slumped over asleep in the wheelchair. That moment, I can still see it now. When I was rushed to the big hospital, I was in the emergency room. They were fighting to save my life. I floated out of my body up to the corner of the room. I was watching everything happen. They tried to place a PICC line and get fluid into me as fast as possible. Someone was screaming at me to hold still. They were trying to get a vein in my neck. It was scary. There was a lot of blood. I could feel the urgency. And then they took the bag of fluid and put a blood pressure cuff around the outside of it and squeezed the bag of fluid. Those were all things I had never seen before. And just the level of urgency of the other people, it was night and day between the two hospitals, being yelled at both. But at this one, I at least felt like I had a chance to survive. I had more surgery and was in the hospital for another 6 to 8 weeks on bowel rest, no food, no water. And then from that point on, I had an exam under anesthesia, an EUA, every month for years. I don't know how many surgeries I've had, how many times I've been under anesthesia, but it's a lot. We were trying the best we could to save the J pouch, and ultimately it could not be saved. After the void experience, I had to heal to be able to go back in again after the void. In April of 2016, I had the J pouch finally removed, a proctocolectomy, which is basically having your asshole removed. I was cored like an apple. It's the most horrific surgery and recovery. You can't even imagine it. The wound care was barbaric. I kept thinking, after all of this time, we haven't come up with a way to take care of the wounds more advanced than this. There isn't a foam that can be sprayed or something. You have to use a stick and gauze 3 times a day. 26 inches of gauze needed to be shoved into my wound with a stick. I've had to have a wound vac that's literally a vacuum that sucks your wound closed from the inside. I have a lot of personal experience with wound healing, wounds that take years to heal. There's a lot of metaphors and analogies that I think about energetically. I want to share about wound healing energetically and physically. Wounds take the time that they take to heal. The wound itself needs very specific care. Protocol for one that would be helpful on a different wound, it would be harmful. It feels like I went and got very specialized training through the experiences I've had with physical wounds. I would give anything to not know what I know, but I know it. I'm choosing to do something with what has happened to me. I'm choosing to make something with what has happened to me, and I'm choosing to share it. So much of my life has been not my choice. I'm taking the lemons I've been handed. I'm squeezing every last drop out of them. That is my intention with these episodes. I need to tell these stories for myself so that I can hear myself say them. I know that I survived things that people have told me if they had to deal with, they would rather K themselves than live my life. That has been said to my face more times than I can count. I have experienced things that I would not wish on my mother. I was not met with love and support and comfort by people who said they loved me. Thankfully, along this journey, I have had the love and kindness of strangers. They saved my life. Their kindness showed the contrast of the people that claimed to love me. Sharing the first episode, talking about the void, I wasn't sure if I would hear from people from my quote-unquote real life. People that were there. I have, and it's been a disappointment. I received a critique of what I should have said. What I didn't hear was, I'm so glad you survived. I'm so glad you're alive. I'm saying it to myself. I'm so glad you survived. I'm so glad you're alive. What you have just witnessed is me using the diner. I set my camera up. I verbal journaled. I talked to myself about an experience I had in my life. And then I witnessed myself. I watched this episode back. I listened to the words that I said. I noticed my body language, saw the points that brought tears to my eyes and made my voice quiver. I got to know myself by listening to me tell this story about what happened to me.
And then you expressed yourself again from listening and watching yourself. And that is how this void conversation is unfolding. You're using the diner to tell your story. And that's incredible.
A big driving force in creating the Plumb Collective was because I couldn't trust other people. I was all alone in these experiences. When I reached out for help, I was met with people who ended up creating more harm. I needed to find a way to process the things that had happened to me. I knew that I needed to find a way to help myself. These really hard experiences that no one could even listen to me talk about, because as soon as I started talking, the other person would have their own experience with it, and I would end up needing to comfort them, even in professional environments. I needed to find a way to tell my story to myself and then be able to hear my own story told from myself. I needed to be able to witness what I had just said. And that really is what we have created with the Plumb Collective. It's a way for you to connect with yourself, to express yourself, and to witness yourself, so that you get to know who you are, how you feel, and what you want. If you are interested in telling your story to yourself, enter the diner. We made this for me, and we made this for you.
Join us next week for the next part of the void conversation that is unfolding from Rosalee's participation in the diner. Tune in next week for a new episode of the Plumb podcast, where you'll hear a new conversation unfold from a new starting point. The conversation will be different, but we will always express ourselves authentically, and we create the space for you to do the same.